Hello, in this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast, I've assembled some friends of the pod to theorise, guess, predict what's going to happen around the world in 2025. One thing we know for definite, Donald Trump is heading back to the White House, which means all sorts of things in all sorts of places. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and in full transparency, we have recorded this episode of Newscast on the 18th of December. That's 2024. But we're going to be getting our heads into what might happen in 2025, with a particular focus on the arrival of one man in particular. Well, I say the re-arrival of Donald Trump, about to embark on his second term as US president, with his inauguration happening in Washington, D.C. on the 20th of January. Here's one prediction. It'll be really cold. I went to Barack Obama's first inauguration way back in 2009, and it was so freezing, but a beautiful, beautiful sunny day. Right, let me introduce who we've got to help us think ahead to 2025. Obviously from Westminster, we've got Chris Mason. Hello.
Hi.
And also, I'm joined in the studio by our old colleague from Westminster, but who's been in Washington for a few years now, but is visiting for the Christmas break. It's Gary O'Donoghue. Hi, Gary.
I know.
Let's we talk about Nick Clegg and the coalition and what's happening with Andrew Lansley's NHS reforms. Do you know what, Gary? I know you've just legged up the stairs, so I'll let you just get comfy for a second. But Chris, isn't it interesting? Westminster already feels like next year is just going to be dominated by President Trump rather than anything that anyone here does.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we come back and Parliament resumes in the sort of first full working week of January, I think it starts on the 6th of January, sort of all eyes and ears and attention and anticipation will sort of point in Washington's direction and the inauguration. And then after that, there'll be the inevitable question about how soon the Prime Minister will be hopping on the plane and going to the White House. There'll be the whole question around, well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Firstly, there'll be who turns up at the inauguration. I was talking to Nigel Farage the other day, the Reform UK leader, and he was, trumpeting in the way that he frequently does about stuff he's proud of, that, he's going to be there and he's looking forward to it, etc., etc. And then we'll see in real form, as opposed to shadow form, if you like, how the interactions and exchanges and tone and tenor of those things are between London and Washington under sort of Mark II of the Trump administration. That's going to be fascinating around so many different levels. Firstly, the sort of tone and tenor and civility or otherwise of it, and then on so many policy levels, and that'll play out through conversations around Ukraine, around trade, around how Keir Starmer and the government here position themselves in relation to Washington and the European Union, and the trade-offs and decisions that there will be there. It's going to be fascinating to see.
And Gary, I mean, there's loads of kind of policy things we can talk about there, but the inauguration is interesting because Trump's first inauguration really did set the tone for his administration, didn't it?
Yes, it very much did. It was all a kind of about size, as things often are with Donald Trump, and the biggest this and the biggest that, and who's there and who's not there. He invited Xi Jinping to this inauguration, which is not going to happen, by the way. So there's a lot of jockeying about, and he takes these things very personally. You have to be careful about what you say yes to, what you say no to. But the substantive things Chris was mentioning are going to be huge. I'd add into that things like massive differences on climate change, a real difference, emphasis on China. I mean, there's a very pragmatic view here, as I understand it, on the relationship with China, much more hawkish in Washington, particularly with some of the appointments he's made as ambassador in China, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, of course, a massive China hawk. So, you add into all that the historical stuff with the Foreign Secretary calling him a woman-hating, neo-Nazi sympathising sociopath, which is not much of a compliment when it comes down to it. And I think there could be a rocky road ahead, really.
And what do we know that he's already committed to do kind of on day one, day two, first couple of weeks?
Well, day one, don't forget, is solving the Ukraine war. Plus, day one will be the beginning of the biggest deportation of migrants in US history, shortly followed by, of course, Middle East peace. Tariffs on China, but tariffs also on allies, potentially 20% tariffs on the UK and the EU. Now, we don't really know whether he's thinking about those as revenue-raising exercises or as a sort of beginning of a negotiation for a kind of better deal. He believes America is sort of constantly screwed when it comes to other countries and trade deals. He thinks they let everything in and everyone doesn't let any American goods into their markets. So those are, in terms of your starting A4 sheet, there's a whole bunch of those.
And is there any possibility he can achieve any of those things that early?
Well,
or even versions of those things? Because we've learned that quite a lot of what Trump says contains a kernel of something, if not the actual full thing.
He's got the trifecta, which means he has the control of both houses of Congress, House of Representatives and Senate. Now, that helps with legislation, getting stuff through. Tight, very tight in the House, so margins are incredibly difficult for him there. But that will help with things like tariffs, which sometimes have to be put into legislation rather than just decreed from the White House. Climate legislation, again, repealing some of the electric vehicle stuff that Joe Biden passed in his Inflation Reduction Act. That will be helped. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things he can get done, and they are much, much better organised this time around, much calmer. And bear in mind, we were all thinking in the first Trump term, is this an aberration or is this an inflection point? It's now definitely not an aberration.
And Chris, I'm thinking back to when Nick Watt from Newsnight was sat in this studio a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying he'd been buttonholed by a sitting cabinet minister who'd said, "Oh, my cabinet colleagues, including amongst them Rachel Reeves, haven't realised how much of their economic agenda could basically be torpedoed by decisions made by Donald Trump, whether it's direct decisions affecting Britain, like tariffs, or whether it's indirect effects on Britain because of what happens elsewhere in the world economy." Is that the sort of thing you've picked up?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a keen awareness of that. When you have and this would be the case, I think, at any time against any backdrop. But when you have a government here that is making it, has made its central mission being seen to be the kind of custodians of turbocharging economic growth, and the economy is flatlining, even shrinking in recent months, and then you have the potential massive kind of shocks that could come along if Donald Trump follows through on some of these suggestions around tariffs, for instance, and indeed other ideas, then if you're sitting in the Treasury or anywhere else in government, you're aware of the levers that you do have and can pull. And blimey, as this government has discovered in the first few months, you pull some of those and you can cause all sorts of political problems for yourself. But on top of that is the stuff that you have very limited control over, and then you might have to make some tricky decisions on. So, as Gary was mentioning, the just to sort of broaden out a little bit, there's the government saying that in its next few months it's going to try and be, as it sees it, more pragmatic in its outlook on China than recent governments here. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is going to go to Beijing. It wouldn't be a surprise, I think, if the Prime Minister potentially went at some point. Then we know that the Prime Minister is going to go to Brussels at the beginning of February and join leaders of the European Union. The Chancellor herself, as Faisal was telling us on Newscast the other day, was there recently. So on the European front, how does that relationship, this as is badged reset with the EU, go when you might also have a decision to make on how you respond to whatever Donald Trump chooses to do, particularly if there was any distinction between what Donald Trump was willing to do to the EU versus what he might offer to the UK, depending on various other factors. So it's fascinating that, and the interesting thing is that Keir Starmer has had a lot of grief in the last few months. And you can have an argument about whether it's justified or not on this sort of never hear Keir badge, this idea that he spends his entire time on aeroplanes and is never in the country. I've travelled with him on quite a few of those trips, and a lot of them, I think, would be the kind of thing it would be more weird for a Prime Minister not to go to than to go to, like the G7 or the G20 or NATO or whatever, particularly when you're a new Prime Minister and you've got lots of hands to shake that you've not shaken before. But he's aware of that critique, whether it's fair or not, and I think will want to be seen to be focused much more on the domestic agenda and being seen around and about in the UK, etc., etc. And yet the reality of the backdrop going into 2025 is that for so many reasons, as we've already discussed, that international picture is going to be massive and have massive consequences.
And bear in mind, don't forget, Donald Trump has expressed an interest before in a UK trade deal, right? However, the kinds of price that they are looking to exact are things that are going to be really difficult politically here. Access to the healthcare market here. Right, that was a huge hot potato, as we all know. There's been talk about, well, what about all these foods you won't let us export to you in the UK? Chlorinated chicken, hormone beef, this stuff. That's all on the table all over again, which would cause a nightmare for people in Downing Street and Whitehall. So there are so many. I think what's going to be crucial is who he decides to appoint as the next ambassador. And there's been all sorts of rumours swirling around.
Who Keir Starmer will appoint, I guess, as you can.
Exactly, and you've seen some of the names, and one of those names in particular has a big background in trade and trade negotiations.
Peter Mandelson,
indeed,
the job for the EU.
So, exactly. So you can see that might be quite tempting as an option to try and smooth things over like that, if that is what your big focus is, because there's so much politically on geopolitics that they are potentially going to disagree on, that maybe that could be the focus of a constructive relationship, notwithstanding Elon Musk's attempts to interfere in British politics.
Yes, which Chris and I discussed in a previous episode of Newscast. Chris, I'm going to let you go because I know you've got to go and do matters domestic, so speak to you soon.
Happy New Year to you both.
Likewise.
Thank you. And Gary, one of the other themes, I think, is going to be defence spending, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because Trump is going to repeat that tactic he used in his previous presidency, which is to force other NATO countries to up their defence budgets, which then has knock-on effects for their budgets for other things, whether it's the health service or welfare or whatever. Yeah,
not so much burden sharing anymore as burden shifting, as they like to say in Washington. Pay up, pay your fair share. Why are we forking out for your security 3,500, 4,000, 5,000 miles away? That has a massive knock-on, and that's why I think you're seeing a lot of European countries at the moment, sort of before January the 20th, trying to sort of tie down this whole business of Russian assets when it comes to using those or the interest from those to fund the Ukraine war. It's a terrible moment of instability, because not only have you got, what you might say a government sort of looking slightly inwards here at the moment with its own difficulty, you've got chaos in Paris, you've got chaos in Berlin, you've got a huge transition in Washington, which is making every capital around the world recalibrate its thinking and second guessing what happens next. I mean, everything is on the table as far as I'm concerned.
And as we know, Trump admires leaders who are strong, or in his perception, strong. So therefore, a German chancellor presiding over quite a weak coalition, or a French president who is the very definition of a lame
not
duck,
interested.
He's not going to be pleased. Yeah,
that's why he likes Orban, and that's why he likes Putin, and that's why he likes Erdogan. He that strong man approach is something that he believes he embodies, and he believes that the American public has now endorsed.
Now, patiently waiting in the wings was BBC Chief International Correspondent and dear friend of Newscast, Lyse Doucet, who's in Damascus. Hello, Lyse.
Wow. Adam, when we did this last year, who would have thought that I'd be standing on a roof in Damascus and what were the rebels in a corner of this country would now be in power? So it makes me a little bit humble and cautious in predicting for next year.
Or maybe we should just make very, very ambitious predictions that seem really quite unlikely. And I should say, we're chatting on Wednesday the 18th.
Everything is likely.
Yeah, exactly. We're chatting on Wednesday the 18th because we've pre-recorded this episode. And so everything we are about to say may have already happened or become out of date by the time you're listening to this. So let's talk in quite sort of generic, general terms then, Lyse. And I suppose that where you're standing now, Syria, like the changes there will have the knock-on effects to the north, to the south, the east and the west in that region, won't they?
What happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria, and we are already seeing that, even though it is still early. And I have to say, judging by the continuing celebration on the ground here, very heady days of this totally new chapter in Syrian history. We've already seen Israel bombing by the hundreds, saying that it doesn't want weapons to fall into the wrong hands, making it very clear that it wants to ensure that whatever happens in Syria is not disadvantageous to Israeli security. Turkey as well has been very assertive, if not aggressive. It wants to protect its border. And Turkey, of all the countries who are beating a path to the door of the new leaders, has the greatest long-term relationship with them. Turkey stayed when all the other countries, including Western powers, Britain, the United States, have been missing in action. Turkey was always by the rebel side, and so they've stolen a march, and they have their own interests to defend. So the moment we're recording, Adam, is a moment where Syrians are drawing a huge breath in this absolutely breathtaking time, and hoping that this time that all the foreign powers far and wide will put the interests of Syrians first. But I think 2025 is going to see both it's going to be a difficult road ahead, and there is cautious hope, but it will be difficult, and also a settling of the relationship among all the foreign actors in many capitals.
And Lyse, I mean, we've always been interested in what goes on in Turkey, but is this going to be the year where Turkey becomes even more than a regional power and becomes a sort of global power that we're talking about a lot more in globally significant terms?
Well, President Erdogan would love to hear you say that loudly enough so he could hear it. He has always wanted to play the pivotal role here on so many crises. He's tried to be the mediating power. Turkey is, of course, a member of NATO. He's had a back and forth relationship with Donald Trump, and I know you've been discussing this in the podcast so far, but what Donald Trump says and does is going to have a huge impact on events across the Middle East and far beyond as well. And Turkey has good relations with some of the powers who want to also play a role in Syria, and certainly Western powers will try to make sure they're all pulling in the same direction. The Turkish foreign minister said that we have been sending Turkey's messages to the new leadership, the man who's rebranded himself, no longer called by his war name, Abu Muhammad al-Jalani. Now he's just Ahmed Shara. He says Turkey has been saying that we're telling them what Turkey expects and what the world expects. But of course, this new leadership also has its own ideas, and Syrians have their own ideas about the way forward.
And Lyse, give us some thoughts about potential outcomes for Iran, both kind of domestically and internationally.
Iran must be deeply worried. 2024 saw an unprecedented shock to what Iran called its axis of resistance, its ring of fire. Pretty well all of its proxies and partners, be it Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis to a certain extent, the militias in Syria and in Iraq. The fires have gone out in some countries, or they're just embers now. And that has led to speculation, and this will become clear next year, Adam, that now that Iran is losing what it called its forward defense in the region, the partners that allowed it to fight its proxy wars, now that it may have to totally recalibrate, there is strong suggestions, if not steps, that Iran may move closer to weaponizing its nuclear program. It's not far off that. What would have to happen in 2025, it's said that one of the last obstacles for them crossing that line, at least domestically in Iran, is the supreme leader, Khamenei, who has always said that there's a fatwa, an Islamic edict against a nuclear weapon. But there's pressure growing because Iran feels that it has to somehow, it wants us still to have a muscular foreign policy, but it basically has no muscle behind it. But also it knows, the language has been very coded, but we know exactly what they're talking about. Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel saying to, at this moment, President-elect Donald Trump, that we have made so much progress. Israel taking a lot of credit for what has happened in Syria, because the fall of the House of Assad was really one of the last dominoes. But making it clear there's one last thing to do. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, his whole career has been about stopping Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Now, President Trump has always said, he said repeatedly, and Gary may have already said this, he says, I'm the man who's stopping wars. I don't want to start any. So whether or not he can be persuaded to go for even more direct strikes by Israel against Iran will be a big issue in the year to come.
Yeah,
and
Gary,
Iran knows that. They've already put out the feelers. They've also said they want to have a relationship with Donald Trump. There was the report denied by Iran, but other sources say it actually happened. The New York Times saying that Elon Musk met the Iranian ambassador to New York, the permanent representative there. So it's definitely going to be on the agenda.
Yeah, Gary, what's your take on what Trump has been saying about Iran?
Well, I mean, his policy during the first administration was what they called maximum pressure. And that was what they were absolutely wedded to. They criticised, obviously pulled out of the nuclear agreement, really tried to isolate Iran as much as possible. But at the same time, Donald Trump did pull back when those drones were being shot down and stuff, and didn't actually turn the fighters around at one point from dropping bombs. So there is a sort of a nuance there as well. I mean, Israel comes first. There's no question about that in Donald Trump's administration, in the mind of people around him. And I think they will want to take this opportunity to try and finish Iran. But as Lyse was saying, Iran has these, in a sense, has these two options, doesn't it? It can try rapprochement, or it can double down and say, just try it now that we've got a weapon. So those are the two really sort of the options that seem to be in front. But I think you're going to see some pretty hawkish activity and words from Washington towards Iran in the coming months, and they will see this as a sort of opportunity to redraw the power relationships in that region in a way that we hadn't expected before Syria fell. And particularly, they will take delight from the hit that Russia has taken. Its naval base, air bases in Syria. That was its foothold in the Middle East. That was its influence through Assad and through Iran. Those are big wins for Washington in terms of their ability to dictate what happens in that part of the world.
And Lyse, there's so much speculation about what Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, what his next phase is, because he must feel and does feel pretty chipper about what he's achieved in the previous phase, taking out mostly Hamas and most of Hezbollah.
Yes, well, as let me just add one little last note about Iran. President-elect Trump has made it clear that he's not interested in regime change in Iran. He's always said that he likes the Iranian people. He's not talking about removing the clerics in power. Whereas Prime Minister Netanyahu has all but called. In fact, he has called on the people to rise up, and he's hinted it. Now it's just a matter of time. So that's another area on which they disagree, and everyone says, is he going to bomb Iran or build hotels in Iran? But it'll happen in 2025. Let's see how it plays out. As we're recording, Adam, there's pretty clear signs that this long-awaited, long-negotiated effort at a ceasefire and a return of the Israeli hostages from Gaza is going to be clinched. President-elect Trump has made it absolutely clear he wants a deal before the inauguration on January the 20th, and all signs are that that's going to happen. Every day we're watching what are they're now looking at lists of the prisoners to be released from Israeli jails. Where will they go? Some will be sent abroad, some will be able to stay in the region. What happens to what's left of Hamas inside Gaza? So they're getting really, really close. And when that is done, then of course a whole number of other issues. Well, they've been on the agenda this year, the so-called day after, who governs Gaza. There's still huge gaps between what Israel says it's willing to accept and what Hamas, and indeed what the majority of Palestinians and Arab leaders across the region, some of whom will also have very close relations with President Trump and his team, they have very different ideas about who should be in charge in Gaza, and that will have ripple effects right across the region. The settler movement has been empowered, emboldened by Prime Minister Netanyahu, by Israel's extraordinary tactical successes over the past year and a half. So this will be literally a burning issue in 2025.
Lyse, can I ask you one quick thing? One of the big successes of the Trump's first administration was the Abraham Accords, this sort of normalization between Israel and some Arab states. Do you think they can build on that? Is there room to build on that? There's obviously been a lot of talk about Saudi Arabia and other places too.
As you know, Gary, during the election campaign, Donald Trump said he wants to expand on the Abraham Accords. Let's be clear. This was not a peace treaty. Israel was not at war with the United Arab Emirates, in fact, and with Morocco, with Sudan, and I think the Sudan one wasn't even really concluded. The big prize, as you hinted, is Saudi Arabia. There was a report that the Saudi leadership, most of all the de facto leader, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, had agreed that they would temper their demand that there be a Palestinian state. Clear signs of an establishment of a Palestinian state before they would agree to normalize. And as you know, a strategic relationship with the United States is also part of that. That was denied then. So I think that will definitely be on the agenda, whether it's part of the Abraham Accords. And don't forget that one key element of the Abraham Accords was it largely sidelined the Palestinians, and they wanted to offer, what they did offer the Palestinians was economic investment. That's not what the Palestinians want. Arab leaders, well, Joe Biden's administration all said, Western powers, one after another, who have recognized a Palestinian state this year, are all saying the only solution is to give the Palestinians what they long aspired for, and what a majority of countries worldwide say they are entitled to, which is a Palestinian state side by side with Israel, that so-called two-state solution. Now, whether or not that's going to happen, but Saudi Arabia has not taken that off the agenda. I don't know how they're going to square that, because Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to do that deal. The Americans, whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump, they want to do that normalization deal. But if the Saudis keep saying we want a Palestinian state, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been absolutely clear that he has done everything possible, he's very blunt about it now, to stop the establishment of a Palestinian state. And the far-right wing cabinet ministers who keep him in power, they also say that their Palestinian state is not on the agenda. So let's see, is it going to be a fudge? For the Palestinians, for Arab leaders, it's hard to fudge it. It's a state or not a state.
We're running out of time, which means we don't have a lot of time to discuss Ukraine. But let's look at it this way, Gary. Do we have any flesh on the bones of Donald Trump's boast that he could end the Russian-Ukraine conflict in 24 hours?
We don't. Although, having said that, when the most powerful man in the world, sends these signals, it does make other actors change their behaviour. I mean, clearly there will be enormous pressure in Congress to cut the money. That's one thing. Donald Trump has said that he does think this has to be a negotiated settlement, and that that a lot of people have interpreted that as Zelensky having to settle for having lost territory, and we'll see whether he's prepared to do that or whether he's forced to do that. But at the moment, there is no clear sign of what he's actually proposing, and I don't think anyone really thinks there is a magic bullet. And of course, Vladimir Putin is under his own pressure internally as well, and so we'll see what comes of it. But there's no blueprint for this at the moment, other than the threat of withdrawing the money, which does change everything.
And Lyse, just a last philosophical point for you, which is kind of back to where you started, which is things that seem quite intractable or permanent actually these days can change very quickly.
All the pieces have been thrown up in the air, and they still haven't settled, Adam. And we will see that next year. There's a ceasefire in Lebanon now. There's likely to be a ceasefire in Gaza. There's a whole new order in Syria. We'll see what happens with the Houthis in Yemen, what happens in Iraq, with Jordan, all of the countries watching so closely now, worried about what happens in the region, because they'll all be affected by all of the developments. And I'm going to just conclude with one last. If I heard correctly here on the rooftop in Damascus, that Gary referred to Donald Trump as the most powerful man in the world. That's going to be interesting to see, because the last year of the Biden administration, we saw a lot of talk about whether you call it the global south, the majority, so many countries who saw a double standard in the West in what happened in Gaza, what happened in Ukraine, and there was so much talk of a more multipolar world. Is Donald Trump, because of the way that he is very blunt and literally forceful way of running America and America's place in the world, is that going to mean a reassertion of America's place in the world and American force in the world? It's going to be something we'll all have to watch.
And Lyse, I'm glad we've got you to watch it for us. So thank you very much.
Happy New Year to all of you. Let me just say, let's hope it's a peaceful year, and people who've long longed for just normal lives, peace and prosperity, kids going to school, jobs. Let's just hope for more of that in 2025.
Thank you, Lyse. And Gary, before you go, I just wanted to do something a bit more retrospective and talk about your coverage of the American election campaign this year. First of all, you were there for the first attempted assassination of Donald Trump, and you became a kind of MAGA celebrity almost, didn't you?
I think, I mean, Adam, you, like I, know that there's a lot of luck involved in journalism sometimes, and we were in the right place at the right time. But we were also lucky enough, and we were aware enough, I think, to do the interviews and to hear what people were saying, and we found the right person to tell us what was happening. I mean, that's what we. It sounds silly. That's why journalism is a trade, not a profession, isn't it? We kind of just, use the tools we have, and we let people tell their stories. And we were fortunate to find someone who told an extraordinary story to us within moments of the thing itself happening, and we put him on air. And I think it is probably true that if we hadn't done that, I'm pretty sure that to this day people would still be arguing about what really happened. If that guy hadn't seen what he's seen and told us and was prepared to tell us, and don't forget, we're the enemy in these circumstances. The mainstream media, we're the enemy. But he told us, and that account of what happened has completely stood the test of time. And I hope what that did was that it prevented something else spiralling out of control that could easily have. Someone tapped me on the shoulder while I was on air that night and said, "They shot first. This is bleep war," right? And I thought, God, if we hadn't got the story out as it was, got the facts out early, a whole load of other facts would have filled the vacuum, and who knows what would have resulted. So I think, I hope what we did that night was a service to not just the American people, but to the world, in terms of saying, look, this is what's happened, and that has proven to be true.
A report about a shot that was heard around the world. And then on a kind of philosophical note, and I always ask this question to people, and it's quite a hard one to answer, but what are things that you observed in the election campaign, maybe like bits that we didn't really notice or didn't seem huge at the time, but you can imagine in 2025 those things will come home to roost?
That's interesting. I mean, I think what will come home to roost? I mean, I do wonder. We saw a massive swing of Donald Trump in the Latino community, particularly for him. I do wonder whether, when things start to get difficult with deportations and things start coming closer to home for people, relatives, being taken off to camps by the border, ready to be sent back to Guatemala, Venezuela, wherever. I do wonder whether some of that will come back to haunt some of those people who were very enthusiastic about ideas. I think, and you've seen this in other polities before around the world in history as well. People are well up for strong leadership. Sometimes they're well up for summary justice. They're well up for kind of taking no nonsense, not giving anyone special treatment. But when it knocks on their door, they don't like it so much. And I just wonder whether that sort of strongman leadership, when it starts to filter down into communities, whether people will be quite so enthusiastic about it. That's what I wonder. The other thing that struck me during the election, just to add, every time that everyone says in the American election, people were completely uninspired by the choice, whether it was Trump Biden or Trump Harris. They just thought neither, and don't care. Every time we asked people that question, where they said we just don't, we hate the choice. Every time I pushed them, they came down on Trump's side. So if whenever there was a question of the benefit of the doubt, he got it.
So the evidence was there for people who wanted to listen.
It was
also one last philosophical question. I'm trying to think, when was the last time you and I sat at the same bank of desks in the office in Westminster? Like 20.
On the 27th of December this year. It'll be 10 years since I arrived in Washington.
Okay, seems just like yesterday.
It does.
I wonder, like, how do you feel about British politics now that you dip in as an observer from time to time as opposed to being?
I do, and I recollect that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe I should have stayed, Adam, because as soon as I left, you had 2015, 2017, 2019, 2024. Was that 4 elections in 90?
A lot of politics.
How many prime ministers? I mean, really? It was quite stable before I left, so I'm not quite sure what happened there. But the one...
You were our good luck charm for stability in the UK.
One thing I will say, and this is sometimes this is a danger for foreign correspondents. There's a risk you go native. One thing that has struck me now, having worked 10 years in Westminster, 10 years in Washington, you do have to remember that Britain is a really small country still now. I mean, its influence is still there. It's still a P5 member. It's still one of the largest.
Security Council.
Yeah, it's still one of the largest economies, no question. But quite a lot of the time in DC, they couldn't give a damn what we think.
But yeah, Donald Trump is quite almost obsessed about the British royal family.
Yes.
Not that gets you anything in the global
not
game of Monopoly,
much. But he's obviously a fan of Prince William, who he met at Notre Dame the other day. I can't remember the word he used, but it was complimentary. And he obviously has his golf courses in Scotland, etc. But yeah, we are, while it is still true and has been true since the end of the Second World War, that the absolute central focus of British foreign policy is staying on side with Washington, is making sure we're pretty much in lockstep. And that's been pretty much true, with maybe the slight exception of Vietnam, But, lockstep, that's where the national interest lies, according to prime ministers of all sides. The special relationship is not so special from the other end of the telescope.
A good reality check. Gary, thank you very much, and lovely to catch up again.
Oh, likewise.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast, which actually seemed like a little bit of a planning meeting for every other episode of Newscast we're going to do in 2025. So hope you feel well prepared, and we'll be back with another episode very soon. Bye-bye.